I don't know if it's recording or not. Okay.
Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Good morning, greetings everyone. Welcome back to the course. We're in week 3 of our 8-week course, Sheroes of Resistance, the African women who fought back. So we're looking at African women over the centuries that have fought against various forms of oppression, both internal and externally. We're back in the studio for the first time in a couple of weeks, so it's good to be back. Brother PJ's there running everything technically, and we're at BIA Media as always. So, and again, you can feel free to come here in person if you want to be in the studio as we record, to ask questions, and we can always do that. So you're always welcome here, 235 Montreal Road. And again, if you need anything in terms of audio, visual, there's podcast space to record things or shows. Also, go to BIA Media's YouTube page. You can see the shows that they've done. There's a lot of good content coming out, so please visit it. Also, make sure that you're looking at our course website as well so that you can get the resources that are associated with this course and all the other courses that we've run. Recordings, articles, book chapters, videos, evidence to make this history come more alive for you. So the past 2 weeks, we have looked at ancient African history for the most part. Even though last week we kind of also talked about the anti-colonial struggle in Algeria. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be spending time talking about going back and forth between the contemporary period and talking about the period of the slave trade and colonialism. A very important period, because this period is the one that we're, in essence, coming out of, and partially still in, really. The past 500 years, we've seen slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism. And this period that we're in now is this struggle between neocolonialism and true African Renaissance. So this is the kind of period that we're in. So we're going to talk about various women over the next couple of weeks that struggled against this particular these particular forms of oppression, slavery and colonialism and neocolonialism. The definitions for these three things we will talk about as we go along, but that's what we're looking at today. Today's geographical era, we're going to be focused on Central Africa. We're going to be spending a lot of time in Angola and what's now Angola and modern day Republic of Congo. So that area of Africa is going to be our focus today. We're going to be talking about a number of different women in essentially 2 different time periods. The period at the beginnings of the slave trade in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, and then we're going to talk about the struggle against Portuguese colonialism as well. So today's session, we're going to talk about Queen Njinga of Angola, of Ndongo, excuse me, and how she resisted the Portuguese in Central Africa during the period of the slave trade. We'll talk about Kimpa Vita, another sister in what's now Angola, who resisted spiritually against the Portuguese a little bit later on during the same period of the slave trade. And then we will talk about Deolinda Rodriguez. When we talked about her last year, we're going to talk about her again. And again, struggling against the same forces, but except this time in the 20th century. So about 300 years after Queen Njinga, we'll talk about Deolinda Rodriguez and her struggle and how that connects to Pan-African struggles all over the globe during the time of the 1960s. So that's what we will get into today. The area that we're speaking of, we're going to be focused here, where you see the Kingdom of Congo, but really a little bit further south, because we're going to be talking about the Kingdom of Ndongo and just this general area of Angola. And it's really important to consider this, because the Portuguese, who will be the main opponent of the women that we're talking about today, they were the first Europeans in this time period in Africa to colonize Africa. And they were the initiators of the slave trade. The Portuguese and the Spanish were the initiators of the slave trade that took enslaved Africans from the continent to the Americas. In the 1440s, the Portuguese start making their way down from Western Europe and making contact with Western Africa. And one of the first things they do is start kidnapping people off the coast. This is their introduction to Africa, their reintroduction to Africa. The Portuguese start kidnapping people off the coast, bringing them on ships, taking them to Portugal, having them learn Portuguese, so they would be essentially forced translators. And then they would be ransomed back to people on the coast. When news of this reached Africa, reached what's now Senegal, that the Portuguese were doing this, we have one of the first battles against this European encroachment in Africa, all the way back in 1447. But that didn't stop it. So that's 1447. Fast forward about 50-something years, almost 50 years, and we get Columbus's voyages to the Americas, which opens up this new territory where Europeans begin the genocide against the indigenous population and then bring in Africans to exploit their labor in these new lands, in the Caribbean, and then ultimately in South America and then in North America. When this happens, the two major powers that are involved in these voyages and in this trade are Spain and Portugal. They're the first Western powers to really explore the Atlantic, outside of the Norsemen and those folks that were up in Greenland and Canada and all that. The Portuguese and the Spanish don't want to fight amongst themselves, so they go to the Pope. And the Pope gives a ruling that they're going to divide this new world up. Spain is going to get everything west of a particular line. Portugal is going to get control of everything east of this line. And no consultation with the indigenous people, no consultation with the Africans, of course. So the Pope makes this ruling. And Portugal gets Brazil, and Portugal gets control over the trade of Africans and the papal blessing to set up colonies in Africa. And Spain gets everything west of that line. So this is North America, the Caribbean, and South America with the exception of Brazil. So this is the world that we were talking about at the beginning of the 1500s, where our story will begin today. And what's interesting, what you should pay attention to over the next couple of weeks when we talk about these African women resisting during this time period, we see the same forces at play. And quite frankly, they're the same forces that are at play now, because the struggle continues. As we're struggling to build the African Renaissance, it's the same forces that we are struggling against, and the same forces that these sisters have been struggling against during the time periods that we're going to talk about. Here are the two groups. One, external aggressors. In this case, we're talking about the Europeans. Folks that come into Africa from the outside with the purpose of exploiting African labor and African resources. So that's the first opponent, external aggressors. Folks that come from outside of Africa to exploit African resources and African labor. The second opponent are internal African elites that collaborate with the external forces. These elites live off the exploitation of the African working masses. These elites are driven by greed, they're driven by a desire for power, and they are willing to use any tools necessary, anything that they can to maintain their power, to maintain their ability to exploit the African working masses. So this is the dual struggle, the struggle against an internal African elite. And this is, when I say the African elite, I'm talking about folks on the continent as well as in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, in communities in North America, in South America, wherever African communities are. There's these group of people that live off the exploitation of other African people. And they work hand in hand with the external aggressors. Those folks outside of Africa or outside of African communities that want to exploit African labor and resources. They work hand in hand. Sometimes they're at odds with each other, but both of them seek to exploit African labor and African resources for their own gain. The African elite, they don't have the best interest of African people in mind, even though they attempt to portray themselves as that. So this has been the dual struggle for the past 500 years, and we're going to see how this begins. Because there was, in every community, everywhere in the world, Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, there's always been groups of people that have attempted to exploit other groups of people. That happens everywhere. It still happens. This is the struggle that human beings have waged in their societies. You got people that want to live off of other people's labor and other people's resources. The issue is when it comes to Africa, as the rest of the world is struggling against that, we're also struggling against external partners that ally with those folks. See, in Europe, the people are struggling against exploiters. It happens. In Asia, they're struggling against exploiters. But Europe, and by extension, America and Canada and all of its colonies, has had for the most part, for the past 500 years, has had the privilege of fighting those battles without external interference, powerful external interference. So that's the key difference. So that's the struggle. So we're going to talk about this struggle over the next couple of weeks. All right, let's start with Queen Njinga Mbandi. Now, you might see her name pronounced Nzinga, but historians, particularly Thornton and Linda Haywood, whose book we'll talk about soon, they kind of said, the more proper way, and particularly when we look at how the Kiambundu language is spoken, is probably a J. So it's Njinga, but you will see in other texts and other videos and things, her name pronounced Nzinga. Matter of fact, Netflix did a really, really good docu-series on Queen Njinga that came out last year. It came out, I think, after our class, in between the last time we ran this course and now. And it's actually really good. It's really good. I could tell that they relied on Linda Haywood's book quite a bit to craft the narrative. So it's part documentary, so you have people talking about Queen Njinga, and it's part fictionalized action scenes and dramatized scenes. And the acting is really good, the action is very good, and it sticks to the history as much as possible. So I recommend that. And I don't recommend a lot of things on African history, particularly on Netflix or big budget things, because they often twist things around. But this one is actually really well done and sticks to the history quite a bit. So we see her years, 1581 or 1583. There's some contention about her birth year, all the way to 1663. These are her years, very important years in African world history, because this is when the slave trade is starting to really, really pick up. And we're going to see how that affects her. But it didn't begin during this time. It actually goes back. Our evidence for her, Portuguese colonial records, records of Catholic missionaries, Africans that also converted to Catholicism who lived at the time and worked in and around her kingdom, wrote about her. We have Dutch records that talk about the Dutch interactions with her, and we'll talk about how she related to the Dutch in a few minutes. So we have these written records. And then we also have oral history. We have Kikongo oral history. We have Kiambundu oral history. These are the two large kingdoms in the region at the time. So there's a lot of oral history that we can rely on to reconstruct this era. Again, as I always mention, the secondary sources that use the written record and the oral history to talk about this period, we have a lot of those secondary sources on the website, so please check those out. All right. The one that I've been pushing for the past couple of years is Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen by Linda Haywood. She's a professor at Boston University. She gave the first full-length biography of Queen Njinga, published in 2019. This book shows what a master historian goes about doing their work. Linda Haywood relied on records where she had to go to Portugal and go into the archives. She had to go to Italy to go into the archives because there's Italian missionaries that had reports on Njinga. So she really combed the archives and did the real craft of a historian to create this biography. And it reads well. It's relatively cheap on Amazon or any other bookstore. If you can get it from a black bookstore, get it from a black bookstore. And it's well worth the read. So get this if you can. This is the kingdom that we'll be talking about, the kingdom of Ndongo. It's just south of the larger kingdom of Congo. The kingdom is called Ndongo. The people that make up the ethnic group, the nation that make up the kingdom of Ndongo are the Mbundu people. Mbundu, and the language they speak is Kiambundu. So when I talk about the Mbundu people, that's Nzinga's people. Nzinga is Mbundu. The name of her kingdom is Ndongo, and the language they speak is Kiambundu. So that's very important to break those things down. So I don't want to start with Ndongo right away. I want to start with the kingdom to the north, Congo, Because in this region of West Central Africa, it's the Kingdom of Congo that has the first relationship with the Portuguese, long-term relationship with the Portuguese. They're the ones that engage the Portuguese as they're making their way down the coast of Africa. They form this relationship that's going to have lasting consequences for the rest of the continent. And the relationship that we see between the King of Congo and the King of Portugal and the state of Portugal is a prime example, and one of the earliest examples and one of the clearest examples of this dual struggle that Africans are continuing to fight against. African elite allied with external aggressors. So what happens with the Kingdom of Congo? Well, in the early 1500s, the Portuguese make their way to the Kingdom of Congo, and they attempt to have a trading relationship with the king. At this point in the game, the Europeans and Africans aren't that much, there's not a level of technological inequality between Africans and Europeans at this time. If Europeans couldn't just outright take over parts of Africa, they didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the skill, it wasn't as unequal as it would be years later. So they have to come with diplomacy. So the Portuguese come and they interact with one of the kings. They attempt to convert him to Catholicism. The king converts for a little bit, but then he realizes that the Catholics want him to divorce his wives, which is not going to happen because the multiple marriages that this king has are not just romantic, but they're also political. He marries these women to show allegiance to the various other elites in his kingdom. So he reneges from Catholicism and goes back to his traditional religion. But while all this is going on, one of his sons becomes a devout Catholic. He actually goes to the Portuguese schools and he gets renamed Afonso I. And when his father dies, Afonso I, with the backing of the Portuguese, because the Portuguese see him as this is somebody that we can ally with. And in many African kingdoms, and we'll note this as we talk about this period of African history, succession wasn't automatic. It wasn't that the eldest son of a king would automatically become the king upon the king's death. That's not how it worked. There was usually a number of potential successors to the king, including the king's nephews, usually by his sister, because a lot of African kingdoms were matrilineal. You had to be related to the royal family through your mother in a lot of instances. So the king would have sons and daughters, he would have nephews, cousins, brothers, all these people with a claim to the throne. Afonso was one of these folks. But Afonso had an ace up his sleeve. He had the Portuguese. He had Portuguese firearms, he had Portuguese support, and he had support of some of the other local elites. And Afonso, who wasn't even the favorite going into the succession battles, emerges as the king of Congo. And he looks upon the Portuguese as his equals. They're equals in the fact that they're royal. When I say the Portuguese, I mean the Portuguese king. That they're both royal, they're both of royal blood, and they're both Catholics, so they're brothers in Christ. While all this is going on, this is the early 1500s, the Portuguese are also operating across the Atlantic in Brazil. Remember, the Pope gave the Portuguese Brazil. So the Portuguese are in Brazil, seeing what's there, exploiting the native population, and then they say, you know what? Let's start bringing African labor to reap the benefits of Brazil, the agricultural benefits of Brazil, the metallurgical benefits of Brazil. Brazil had silver, Brazil had gold. We're going to mine in Brazil. We can have farms in Brazil. We need labor for this because the indigenous population is not working out. They're able to run away and hide. They're dying from diseases that they weren't familiar with, they didn't have before the Europeans came. They're dying at an incredible rate. We need Africans. They don't have the same, they're immune to they're not as susceptible to these diseases as the indigenous population because there's been a longer interaction between Africans and Europeans. So diseases have been shared, people have built up immunity, that type of thing. So they start bringing African labor to Brazil. And this relationship between the king of Congo and the king of Brazil becomes one of the Europeans requesting more and more labor. So they don't want to trade anything else. They want bodies. They want bodies to send to Brazil. And they're sending their businessmen, their traders to come to Africa to get bodies. And King Afonso is looking at his kingdom and he's seeing what's going on. And remember, the Portuguese had a hand in putting him in power. But now he's saying, wait a minute, what are you doing? You're depopulating my kingdom. How can I be a king if I have no subjects? Because you're taking all my subjects to Brazil. Your businessmen that are here operating are just taking people. And we have to go back. The Kingdom of Congo, like many kingdoms in Africa, had a servile class. There are people in Africa, whether as a result of warfare or people that get into their debt and they sell themselves into servitude. Or you lose a war and your population gets put into servitude. You're still considered a human being, but you're in the condition of servitude. So there were people that existed like that in the Kingdom of Congo. And they worked for the king, they worked for different noblemen, and that was their job. And these were the folks that often would get sold to the Europeans, which was kind of understood. It's like, okay, these are servants. You need servants? Here, we can sell you these servants. The problem is the Portuguese just start kidnapping anybody, free people, people that weren't in that position of servitude. And the amount of labor requested for Brazil just keeps increasing. So King Afonso has to write his brothers in Portugal. And he writes a series of letters that we still have because he was quite literate. He could speak Latin, he could speak Portuguese, he could write, and he wrote these letters. And these letters are still in existence. You can go to the archives and read them. And he writes his brother, the king of Portugal, and he says, we cannot reckon how great the damage caused by the Portuguese merchants is, since the mentioned merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives, because the thieves and men of bad conscience grab them, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom, which they are ambitious of. They grab them and get them to be sold. And so great, sir, is the corruption and licentiousness that our country is being completely depopulated. And your highness should not agree with this, nor accept it in your service. And to avoid it, we need from your kingdoms no more than some priests, a few people to teach in schools, and no other goods except wine and flour for the holy sacrament. This is why we beg your highness to help and assist us in this matter, commanding your factors that they should not send here either merchants or wares, because it is our will in these kingdoms that there should not be any trade of slaves nor outlet for them. Concerning what is referred to above, again, we beg your highness to agree with it, since otherwise we cannot remedy such an obvious damage. He's begging the king of Portugal to not send any more merchants to his kingdom except the people that have wine and flour so that they can have communion. That's all he wants, and teachers. That's all he wants. Of course, this wasn't heeded. And he talks about what happened. He says, as soon as they are taken by white men, they are immediately ironed and branded with fire. And when they are carried to be embarked, if they are caught by our guardsmen, the whites allege that they have bought them, but cannot say from whom. So that it is our duty to do justice and to restore the freemen their freedom. But it cannot be done if your subjects feel offended as they claim to be. Because he's trying to protect his people as much as possible, but the whites are complaining to the king of Portugal, saying he's interfering with business. We're trying to get these bodies to go to Brazil, and this African king keeps trying to stop us and wants to check our merchandise to see if these people are actually free or if they war captives, or who are the folks that you're trying to take to Brazil, and brand them with iron. So they're already starting the process of dehumanizing African people, branding them, sending them as cattle, as property over to the Americas. And it's really interesting the year that this is written, in 1526, because what we will see is that as this process is happening, these captives aren't just going peacefully, because 1526 is also the same year that Africans taken by the Spanish from Hispaniola. So they were Africans that were transported from Africa first to Hispaniola. So that's the island that's Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They were taken there first, and then they were taken from there to what's now the United States. And these are the first Africans that we know of collectively as a group that were brought to what's now the United States. So it's before 1619. This is 1526, the same year that he writes this letter. These Africans are taken to what's now South Carolina, and they revolt immediately. They have a revolt with the indigenous population in South Carolina, and they burn down the proposed colony of the Spanish, and they run off and get their freedom. So the first act, the very first act, historical act that we know of Africans that will become African Americans, was an act of revolution, was an act of revolt. All the way back in 1526, the same year that King Afonso was writing this letter to his quote-unquote brother, the King of Portugal. But you see what happens when I tell this story. And of course, the King of Portugal didn't listen to it. But this is the process. This is how we've gotten into the situation that we are in and still in today. You have African elites. He starts his career with a desire to be king, and he will ally with the Portuguese. And then he comes to find out that what he is sitting on is being undercut by the greed of the Portuguese. But by this point, it's too late for him to do anything with it because he already put himself in bed with them. He's been indoctrinated. He becomes a Catholic. He thinks that this is going to protect him. And so many of our leaders think that if we just dress like Europeans, have European names, espouse European values, that we will be fine. But that's not the case because even they don't believe what they're preaching because they're stealing people, exploiting resources. So all this is happening. And this is a pattern that we're going to see continually. There's a couple of things with this. So succession has always been, for the past 500 years, continues to be an issue. It's something that external aggressors can easily take advantage of. Whenever there's political chaos, there's multiple people vying for a throne or vying for an office of presidency, an external aggressor can say, hey, if we back you, when you become king, when you become prime minister, when you become president, make sure you look out for our interest. And that interest inevitably sets back African development, as you can see here. So this is where this begins. This is where this process begins. And as a result of this, we're going to see a number of sisters like Njinga rise up to challenge this and continue to rise up. In 2023, they're continuing to rise up. So this depopulation, this is happening all over the continent at this point, by the time we get into the 1600s. And it's not just the Portuguese anymore. Now the Dutch are involved, and the Danish, and the English eventually get involved, and the French get involved, all using the same playbook. You go into Africa, you find a ruler that you could either work with, or you find someone that's under him or in a neighboring community near him, you work with them, you cause warfare, that war is going to cause captives to be obtained. Those captives can then be sold to the Europeans, and then they'll be shipped to the Americas. That's the playbook. Warfare, chaos in Africa, captives, those captives sold to the Europeans. And if we can't get captives, then we'll just start kidnapping people. Or we will form relationships with these kings that we help put in power and say, we don't want anything from you. We don't want gold. We don't want cowrie shells, which is the currency in a lot of places in Africa. We don't want cowrie shells. We don't want gold. We don't want precious wood and animal skins. We want people. That's it. That's the only thing that we're going to trade with you with. If you want the things that we got, and again, another one of the ways that African elites get suckered in because they want the things that Europeans have. They want the European clothes. They want the European cloth. They want the European trinkets and other things. The guns that really aren't even the state-of-the-art guns, or the guns that the Europeans don't even want anymore. All of these things. You want these. We don't want what you got. All we want is people. And this is going to lead to the problems that we see. So this is happening all over the continent at this point. So by the time Queen Njinga is young, her father is struggling against the Portuguese. Her father is Mbande a Angola. He's the king of the kingdom of Ndongo. He went through his own succession battle to become king. And then when he dies, his son takes over, Angola Mbande, Njinga's brother. Now, from all accounts, Njinga was probably much smarter than her brother, better trained militarily than her brother, but her brother was able to get the support of a number of the other elites in the kingdom. The way the kingdom of Ndongo was set up was very similar to other African kingdoms at this time. You had a king, but the king wasn't an all-powerful ruler. The king sat at the top of the pyramid, and then you had governors, regional governors, that also had their own autonomy. These governors, in the case of Ndongo, were called sobas, S-O-B-A, sobas. These sobas, sometimes they were relatives of the king, sometimes they were people that were influential in the region before it became part of the kingdom, and they had their own control. So the kingdom's at the top, then you got these sobas, and the king had to make sure that he had the allegiance of at least the majority of the sobas so that things could function well in terms of governance, in terms of tax collection, all these things that would keep the king rich. But in a system like this, oftentimes these Sobas might want the throne for themselves, or they might want someone else in the royal family to be king. So it's always this constant battle between the center, the king, and the periphery, these Sobas, into the Portuguese. The Portuguese are able to take advantage of this. So whenever a king or a queen dies and there's a succession battle, remember, there's a number of people that could be king. There's children of the king, there's brothers of the king, there's nephews and nieces of the king, there's these Sobas that all have their own regional power. So it's like in Canada or the United States, you have the prime minister, and then you have these governors that have their certain territories. But in this case, the governors also can ally themselves with the Portuguese. And the Portuguese want there to be chaos. They want wars. Because if there's wars, that means they're captives. And there's captives, that means these are people that can be taken to the Americas. If there's peace in Africa, if the situation is stable, then there's no captives. There's nobody to be taken to Brazil. So the Portuguese want chaos. So when they see that whenever there's a succession battle, that we can get some of these regional governors, we'll go to the regional governor and say, hey, the king hasn't been doing too well by you. Why don't you work with us and you can rebel against the king. And any forces that you get, that you capture from him, you sell to us, then we'll give you guns, and that'll make you stronger, and every person that the king loses makes him weaker. So doesn't that sound like a good deal? And some of these Sobas that aren't thinking about anything other than their own power will make these deals with the Portuguese. So all of this is going on. It's a very tenuous political situation. And her brother has to navigate all this because, again, he gets to the throne after a war, and there are still elements in his kingdom that aren't happy that he's on the throne. So he constantly has to fight these little internal battles, these rebellions against these regional leaders, and at the same time watch out against the Portuguese. He's not effective in this. And at the same time, the Portuguese have set up a permanent colony in Angola called Luanda, which is one of the first permanent European colonies established in Africa. It was established in the 1500s. The Portuguese were the earliest colonizers in Africa in this current period, and one of the latest to leave. So we're talking about from the 1500s all the way up to 1975, the Portuguese were in Africa. Most of the other Europeans, true colonization doesn't really occur until the 1800s, really the end of the 1800s. But the Portuguese have been there since the 1500s. Established this colony at Luanda that they're not going to lose until 1975. So they're there. Angola has to negotiate with the Portuguese. He's not really that smart. He sends his sister to go because his sister is operating basically like a prime minister. Actually, a minister of foreign affairs would probably be the better title. Let me flash back a little bit. In order to solidify his reign as king and to make sure that his sister and any of her supporters can't challenge his throne, he has her son killed. Her brother has his own nephew killed as one of to ease his way to the throne, to make sure there's no other potential successors, even though Njinga herself could have succeeded him, which she ultimately does. But he had her son killed. We'll come back to that in a minute. So he sends Njinga to the Portuguese to negotiate. And this is where one of the most famous events in African history actually happens. I'll go back to this. But the Portuguese find out that Njinga is coming to negotiate on behalf of her brother. Portuguese, of course, have their good old-fashioned European patriarchy and sexism. They don't want to negotiate with a woman. So they bring her into the room, and they're seated in chairs, and they want her to stand for the entire negotiation. They're almost trying to embarrass her. But her power is such that all she does is kind of snap her fingers, and one of her servants gets down on all fours and makes a chair for her. This was a show of power on her part, to show that you're not going to try to embarrass me in these negotiations. Look how powerful I am. So right from the jump, Njinga is showing that she's not a woman to be trifled with. She negotiates with the Portuguese to make sure that they're not going to be aggressive to her brother. She actually converts to Catholicism during this time, gets baptized, gets the European name Anne. Because according to Europeans, you can't be a Christian without a European name. I don't know where it says that in the Bible, but that's what the Europeans say. So while all this is going on and these battles are happening, I just want to zoom out a little bit to show you how connected all of this is. All these battles for succession, who's going to be king, and regional fights, all these captives are being taken by the Portuguese to Brazil. And just like what happened in 1526 with the Africans in South Carolina revolting, the Africans in Brazil start revolting as well. So throughout this whole period, what you see is happening in Africa is affecting what's happening in the Americas, because these Africans, war captives, are coming to Brazil, realizing where they're at, and they're continuing to fight. They're continuing to struggle for their freedom. So when people try to present slavery as, oh, well, it's just these sad Africans were just put on the boat, and then when they got there, they just accepted their fate, and they just worked it. No, people resisted every step of the way. They resisted on those boats, and then when they got to the Americas, they resisted. And one of the greatest forms of resistance was the nation that they built in Brazil called Angola Janga, Little Angola. They came from Angola, so they named where they got to Little Angola. A completely independent African nation in Brazil. These Africans left the plantations, they left the mines, they ran away and formed their own community. In these communities, you had women with political leadership. You had men with political leadership. They took African political systems, modified them to the new situations that they were in. They even modified their religions. They combined it with Catholicism, with African religion, with even the spirituality of the indigenous people that they came across. Because they realized in this new land, there's new spirits that we're not familiar with. So we need to talk to the original inhabitants of this land to figure out what we need to do spiritually to survive. So you had all of this come together, and they formed these communities. People like Teresa de Benguela, people like Dandara of the Palmares, or Dandara of Little Angola. These are the African women resistance leaders that would emerge in Brazil, that came out of this cultural context of Central Africa during this time of warfare. So very important. And this republic, this nation that existed in Brazil lasted for almost 100 years. And they fought against the Portuguese, and they fought against the Dutch at the same time that Nzinga is going to be doing the same thing. So I just wanted to show that as well, see how all this is connected. So eventually, she becomes the ruler of Ndongo. Her brother commits suicide because he just can't deal with all the stress. And there's some reports that Nzinga kind of encouraged him to commit suicide by her constant taunting of him, saying, our father wouldn't have never allowed the Portuguese to get, as much land and influence as they've been able to get, and they're trying to force you to convert to Catholicism. You should never convert to Catholicism. You represent our ancestors. And she's just constant needling, and then he's losing influence. Sobas are going to the side of the Portuguese. He ends up killing himself. When he does that, there's another battle for leadership. Nzinga comes out on top because she has the support of a number of the key influential Sobas. She has the support of the religious authorities because even though she got baptized as a Catholic, she's still an ardent practitioner of their ancestral religions. So she has the support of the religious folks. She has the support of influential Sobas in the military, and they see her as the best candidate to rule. One of the ways she solidifies her rule is when her brother committed suicide, he had left behind a son. And at first, he was named the successor, but Nzinga had him killed. Her brother killed her son, so she killed his son. The night that she got married to another influential leader in the region, they had a wedding, the son was there, and the son died at that wedding. So Nzinga killed her nephew the same way her brother killed his nephew. She becomes the ruler. She sees what the Portuguese are doing, and for the rest of her career, is going to be a battle against the Portuguese, using diplomatic measures, religious diplomacy, and then when that breaks down, armed conflict. She associates herself with a group called the Mbangala, a group of mercenaries in the region that who decided that instead of being victims of the slave trade, that they were going to become aggressors. So this group called the Mbangala emerges in the region, and they are ferocious fighters, and they are mercenaries. And you can't be born into the Mbangala, you have to be initiated into the Mbangala. So she actually gets initiated into the Mbangala to continue her fight against the Portuguese. So she used tactical retreats, and she conquered new areas, a whole new kingdom east. When the Portuguese attacked her kingdom and she had to retreat, she conquered another kingdom, the kingdom of Matava, and used that as her new base to fight against the Portuguese. She took advantage of European rivalries, which is what many great African leaders do. Because when there's chaos among Europeans, Africans can take advantage of it just the way Europeans can take advantage of chaos among Africans. So when the Dutch and the Portuguese started fighting, and there's a period where the Dutch actually take over Brazil and take over a lot of the Portuguese colonies in Africa, Nzinga allies herself with the Dutch, tactically, to fight against the Portuguese. And she's successful in this till the Portuguese, regroup and they actually take Portugal back from the Dutch and take their colonies back from the Dutch. But at this point, they're tired of fighting, and they're tired of fighting Nzinga and her troops. And she's using all the tactics of warfare, guerrilla warfare, sieges. She's using religious diplomacy. She would write to the Portuguese as a fellow Catholic and say, let's negotiate. You don't want to keep fighting. I don't want to keep fighting. Let's negotiate. So after many, many, many years of back and forth battles between her and the Portuguese, they would sign a treaty in 1657, which recognized her as queen. Because up until this point, the Portuguese didn't even recognize her as queen. They were backing somebody else in the succession battles. And she was fighting to be recognized as queen. The Portuguese had to recognize her as queen and recognize her territory. So she was successful, and she passes away a couple of years later and names her sister as her successor. So Nzinga's experience, and one of the other things that she did, because she knew the Portuguese relied on captives for slavery, she said, anybody that escapes from the Portuguese, you will get sanctuary in my kingdom. So we got to think about the slave trade and how it was set up. The Europeans would stay on the coast until they got their ships filled up to make the voyages. So if you were captured, you might not leave Africa for a few months. You might be in these slave prisons or working for the Portuguese in Luanda or in these other places for a few months to even a year before you be transferred to Brazil. So there was still time to even revolt during these periods. So Nzinga would say, if you get captured by the Portuguese and you escape and you make it to me, you'll have sanctuary. So people heard this and they ran to Nzinga. She was able to build her army as well as weaken the Portuguese during this time. So she was successful in her fight. Totally successful? No, she didn't get all of her territories back, but she was able to get a good amount of it back. She was able to take advantage of European rivalries. She was able to use diplomacy. She was able to use warfare, tactical retreats, guerrilla warfare, all these things to her advantage to get the things that she wanted to do. Very important leader that we should all know about in African world history. There's a statue to her in Angola because the people recognize what she did in her fight to maintain sovereignty, her fight against an external aggressor. This would continue with folks like King Pavita. I'm going to talk about her briefly, so we'll go to our Q&A, and then we'll go into more modern times. King Pavita used religious strategy as well, but this is in the kingdom to the north, the Kingdom of Congo. Again, going all the way back to Alfonso I, the Kingdom of Congo had been destabilized due to their relationship with the Portuguese. And all the way up until about a couple of years after Nzinga passes away, it's become worse. And the actual King of Congo has been, just completely, his position has become one that's untenable. He's dealing with the same things they're dealing with in Congo: constant civil wars, constant intrusion by the Portuguese, a lack of respect for the title of Mani Congo, the King of the Congo. So this woman emerges, King Pavita. She's a noble woman. In a book is written by her by John K. Thornton, the Congolese Saint Anthony. She's a noble woman. She's well versed in and again, just to get a map of what we're talking about, this is the Kingdom of Congo. And at the time, there's a succession battle between Pedro IV and Jao II. And you see at this point, this is about 100, 200 years after King Alfonso. All these kings of Congo have European names because that's part of the colonial process. So they're fighting to become king. The Portuguese are there enslaving people as a result of these battles. And this noble woman emerges. And she had been trained in Congo spirituality. She also was a Catholic. And one day, one of the things that should be familiar to anyone that studies African religion, spiritual possession is a key element of it. Still a key element, even in African expressions of Christianity. If you go to Church of God in Christ, Pentecostal church, you see people get the spirit. They get possessed by spirits. In African religions, people get possessed by spirits. Well, King Pavita gets possessed by the spirit of Saint Anthony, who is the patron saint of Portugal. So imagine this. The Portuguese are praying to Saint Anthony to give them blessings in the slave trade and blessings in exploiting Africa and all that. And all of a sudden, this African woman, not a man, this African woman says, I'm possessed by St. Anthony, and I've come to tell you to stop the slave trade, number one. That's what I'm telling to the Portuguese. And what I'm telling to the Africans is, everything that the Portuguese have told you is wrong. The stuff that happened in the Bible, it didn't happen in Palestine, it happened in Africa. Jesus is black, the disciples were black, everybody in the Bible is black, and they're Congolese. And the Portuguese have been keeping this from you. And they've been keeping this from you to exploit you. And what we need is a strong king in Congo to protect the masses from slavery, to protect them for the Portuguese. We need to get the Portuguese out of Africa. And I'm speaking this not as King Pavita, but as St. Anthony. St. Anthony is speaking to you. This was way too much for the Portuguese. They're like, wait a minute, what? You have this African woman that's saying she's possessed by our patron saint and telling us that we're wrong and all of this? She's purported to have conducted a number of spiritual miracles, healed people. And because of this, thousands of people flocked to hear her message. Thousands of Congolese see her as really the embodiment of St. Anthony, the embodiment of spiritual resistance. And she's able to amass these forces. And the Portuguese are freaking out. They're going to the rulers that are under them and saying, you need to take care of this woman. She's messing things up. And her movement becomes one of the more powerful in Congo. She would eventually end up pregnant, which kind of, the Portuguese used as an opportunity to say, see, she's a false prophet. She said she was pregnant by the Holy Spirit or whatever. And she's eventually captured by the Portuguese and she's burned at the stake. But that didn't end her movement. The thousands of people that followed her eventually go from being a relatively peaceful spiritual movement to becoming a rebellion. And they rebel in the Kingdom of Congo. And there's many more battles for years after she actually is killed. And a lot of her followers end up in the Americas. And when they get to the Americas, guess what they do? They keep fighting. One of the most important rebellions that happened in the United States, again in South Carolina, in the Stono Rebellion, was led by Antonians, or followers of King Pavita. So you see all these connections that happen throughout the world. But we'll stop there before we talk about Diolinda Rodriguez, because she is an African woman that's going to come out of the same cultural context about 300 years later from Njinga. And we're going to talk about the similarities in her fight in the same region. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Daniel to alert me to anything in the chat or any questions. So you can raise your hand if you have any questions. Anything in the chat, Daniel?
No, there's nothing in the chat, but David, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. Was wondering if you could clarify the being possessed by the spirits from a biblical standpoint or perspective. Folks don't get possessed. We understand that people are tripart beings, mind, body, spirit. So you already have your spirit, and you are, when people are dropping down or whatever in whatever churches, that is said to be touched by the Spirit, but not possessed. So embodying the Holy Spirit, that doesn't happen in Christianity as far as I know. But so can you expand on that thought process?
I think it's just a matter of words. Touched by the Spirit versus possession, because even possession is probably not the best word to use, because even in African spirituality, it's mounted by spirits. And we talk about voodoo or Risha, mounted by the Spirit is actually the better way to talk about it. But when you look at it, when you look at how people, the physical manifestation of what that looks like in African communities, whether they're Christian, whether they're traditional African, is very similar. It's very much the same. How they interact, what the Spirit does to them, how people talk about what it felt like to be in the Spirit, how it wasn't them, and the actions that they had, it wasn't them actually doing it. It was this other thing using their body. That is what I'm getting at, if that makes sense.
And I get that, so thank you for the clarification. However, well, I don't want to say however, Christianity doesn't talk about the Holy Spirit taking over a body, a person, that the idea of free will going out the window, if that is where if it's going, the Christianity that I've studied doesn't talk about that. The individual always has their free will. Holy Spirit doesn't take over them, and if they are feeling taken over, it's not God.
Well,
is what I've been told.
See, and this is one of the things. So that when you say you were told, you talk about in terms of a theological like setting, like discussion.
Yeah. I studied.
Yeah,
like 10
that's
years.
the difference. That's the difference. In a lot of these churches where these things are happening, you're not getting a whole lot of theology. You see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
this was actually one, and this is kind of it's going off conversation, but it's connected. When the Pentecostal churches emerged in Africana communities, particularly, I can speak from the U.S. experience, churches like the Church of God in Christ and others, they were often led by pastors and preachers that had no theological training at all. What they were able to do, they were able to take because this idea starts with the Europeans actually at first, not the idea of mounting or being touched by the Spirit, but in Christianity, in the American context, you had this thing called the Great Awakening around the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, where you had these Pentecostal pastors that were going around, going to different communities, doing things. And one of the things that they did was they actually preached to enslaved Africans. And they did it charismatically, and people would get touched by the Spirit, Europeans, and speak in tongues and all this. And for enslaved Africans that weren't Christian, that came from these African contexts where people get mounted by spirits all the time, this looked relatively familiar. So a lot of the early African Pentecostals came out of this context. They were enslaved people that had some knowledge of Christianity, but again, you got to remember, they're not getting theologically trained because Africans aren't even supposed to be able to read. So they come out of the period of enslavement and they combine the African traditions of being mounted by spirits. They combine all these things with this great awakening that's happening among European Christians, and they create this African Pentecostalism that we see expressed in the Church of God in Christ, some of these other African-American Pentecostalism. And the criticism that they got from more established black, and I say black, African-American denominations like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Zion Church, the Black Baptist, was that y'all doing that slave stuff, that African stuff, we don't believe in that. You go to AME churches, you go to Baptist church, they don't do that. The falling out, the speaking in tongues, the people running around the church, and all that, they don't do it. So and they were criticized, those folks, and you could start to see a class divide even among that too, because it was the poorer, more folks that were less likely to be literate, more likely to be working class, and the pastors were the same, coming out of that same social condition that created those types of churches. So, yeah, what you're saying is correct. And does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm all in. It sounds, you explained your perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. We could have we need to probably have a class on spirituality.
I look forward to it.
That one would be good. These are how our classes get started, everyone. This is how the Robeson seminar did. We have these discussions and they go places. Robin, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. A couple of different related comments, actually. But so you mentioned there were two groups that black folks kind of had to deal with back then and still are today. And one was the external folks, external group, and then the internal African elites. To that, I would add a third group, which is I guess I'll call them the internal African non-elites, and that is it's a spectrum of people, but basically folks that the system has caused a number of folks to collaborate with the system to different degrees, right? But the thing is, what they get from that collaboration doesn't even turn them into elites, right? They're not even elites, but they're still doing that collaboration. So that's one. And then related to your other comment, you mentioned in Zinga had used divide and conquer techniques. So just to let you know, I'm doing a little experiment very much related to this. So there's a guy I've mentioned who's again one of these internal Africans who's collaborating, and what he's getting hasn't even made him an elite, but it has made him a member of the Peel Police Services Board. Okay, so the little divide and conquer experiment I'm doing is raising issues around that and basically trying to get his board members to turn against him. So I'll let you know how it goes. Because this is we gotta, for sure, we have to use the oppressor's tools against them, and they can prevent them.
All right. Yeah, I agree. And I think the best formulation I've seen of that idea is Sekou Touré. We'll talk about probably another time, but he was the leader of the People's Democratic Republic of Guinea. The Democratic Party of Guinea, and he was the leader of Guinea Conakry from 58 to the 80s. And he was also a political theorist, African political theorist. And he wrote about the people's class versus the anti-people's class. And it's just that, and this is just what we see playing out here. People's class is those people that work for a living, they're workers, they don't intend to exploit anybody, they do their work. And then you got this anti-people's class that, yeah, some are elites, and then some are aspiring elites that either live off the exploitation of other people or aspire to live off the exploitation of other people, and they will retard African development. Again, that's another political theorist and ideas that we could spend the whole class on talking about Sekou Touré. But I'll leave it there. I just wanted to say I definitely agree with what you're saying. There are people that want to be elites. So let's talk about this young woman, this Deolinda Rodriguez, who's in this same tradition. So fast forward about 300 years from Njingo. The Portuguese go from having a colony of Luanda to colonizing all of Angola. They also colonized Guinea-Bissau, and they also colonized Mozambique. These are the Portuguese colonies in Africa. They're there the longest, and it takes the longest to get the Portuguese out. So by the time Deolinda Rodriguez comes along, she comes along at the height of the anti-colonial struggle throughout Africa. And the Portuguese are the last European powers to leave. So she's born in Angola, and she's the child of middle-class parents. One thing that we'll see in a number of revolutions, it's often the middle class that provides the leadership. Why that is, it's because the middle class is able to see both sides of the conflict and at this really unique position. They can go either way. They get the training from the Europeans or the training from the oppressive classes. They see the hypocrisy in it, and they connect themselves with the working class. Because if you're in the middle class in Africa, or even in African communities, you're only a stone's throw away from the working class. You have relatives that are in the working class, your position is tenuous, so you're able to see things in a way that other folks can't. We look at people like Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, who was in the kind of middle class of enslaved people. He got his freedom. He didn't need to necessarily be an ally with the revolution, but you're able to see this. You have this interesting vantage point. So a lot of folks, Che Guevara out of Argentina, Fidel Castro was middle. Like, you have these people that come from this position that are able to ally themselves with the working class folks, and often are some of the great revolutionary leaders. She was one of them. Her parents were Methodists, so the Methodists had sent missionaries to Africa, even though most of Angola would be Catholic. These were Methodist folks, and they were middle class, and she went to these schools that were designed to alienate you from your Africanness, from your Angolanness. This is another tactic of colonization. This is what a number of these sisters that we're going to be talking about, they resisted. You see, even in Zinga, she nominally was Catholic, but she maintained her African spirituality, because one of the key tactics of the colonizer is to deculturalize you. That's a way to ease. That's why the first thing they did when they came to Congo, baptize people, change their names. This is part of the process. This is part of the colonial process. It's not part of the Christian process. There's nothing in the Bible that says you need to have a European name to be a Christian. Nothing says that. Nothing says you have to dress like a European to be a Christian. But part of the colonization process is using Christianity as a tool to ease the process. We'll make you Christian, we'll change your name, we'll tell you everything that's associated with your culture, with your people, is of the devil and is wrong. And that way, you're less likely to resist the things that we do. So she grew up in this context, but she realized at a young age that this was wrong. So she rebelled. She wore African clothing when she wasn't supposed to. She spoke her language when she wasn't supposed to. She organized with young students that are looking at the situation in the context of other African folks getting their liberation. Because by the time she's a teenager in the 1950s, the war in Algeria that we talked about last week, or in week 1, is happening. No, last week. We talked about it last week. The war in Algeria is happening. Other folks are using positive action to get independence. The Land and Freedom Army in Kenya, which we will talk about in a couple of weeks, the sisters there are fighting against the British settler colonialism in Kenya. So the entire world, the African world, is uprising by the time she's a teenager. And she sees this middle class in Angola as collaborating with the Portuguese and being depersonalized and being alienated from the growing revolution that's happening among the working class in Angola to get the Portuguese out finally. So she starts joining clandestine groups of young people and college students that are talking about these ideas. She refused to straighten her hair. She spoke Kiambundu. She was active in the Methodist Church and actually eventually studied in Brazil. She had to go to Brazil because she was starting to get noticed by the authorities in Angola, who were monitoring some of these youth groups that were talking about these revolutionary activities. So she ends up going to Brazil. But she used the church as a place to organize. She said, the mission serves us as a place for clandestine movement. Even in our prayers, our eyes speak politics. But Dorothea thinks we are meditating about the Lord's word. But if coming to church on Sundays helps us connect and to do the nationalist work, then we can come to church. This is written in her diary that is I've only seen it in Portuguese. I've not seen an English translation of her diary. This is her diary she kept from a young age up until the time she was martyred, the time she was killed, fighting for liberation. This is one of the most important political works in African revolutionary history. And it's in Portuguese. So if you get it, you have to translate it. It's not in English. But her diary, it's a phenomenal work of an African woman fighting for freedom and using spirituality. In this case, the instrument is the Methodist Church, using it to organize. How many times have we seen this? In fact, she did this and she connected with another African across the ocean that was using Christianity to fight against oppression. When she was in Brazil studying, she heard about the civil rights movement, and she writes to Martin Luther King Jr., and Martin Luther King Jr. writes back to her. And we have these letters in King's Papers, in the digitized collection of King's Papers that you can read. Go online, you go to Stanford University King Papers, and you can read much of the correspondence of Dr. King throughout his career. And one of the letters was to young Deolindo Rodriguez that she's studying in Brazil. And King wrote back to her, he said, I would say, however, because she wrote to him telling him about the racism in Angola and what the Portuguese were doing in Angola and what was happening in Brazil and the racism that she saw in Brazil. So she goes from Angola to Brazil, the same route that so many Africans had gone through enslavement. And she gets to Brazil and she sees the racism of the so-called racial democracy of Brazil and how black folks were treated there, how African people were treated there. And she writes to King asking for advice and what she should do. and telling her about this situation, internationalizing King, and King writes her back. He say, I would say, however, that the first step toward rectifying the situation is to develop real leadership in your country. Some one person or a few persons must stand as a symbol for your independence movement. As soon as your symbol is set up, it is not difficult to get people to follow. And the more the oppressor seeks to stop and defeat the symbol, the more it solidifies the movement. It would be a wonderful thing for you to return to your country with this idea in mind. Freedom is never achieved without suffering and sacrifice. It comes through the persistent work and tireless efforts of dedicated individuals. You must also know that what is happening in other countries in Africa will inevitably have repercussions on your own country. It is impossible for Angola to stand in Africa and not be affected by what is happening in Nigeria and Kenya and Rhodesia, which becomes Zimbabwe. And so your real hope lies in the fact that independence will be a reality in the whole of Africa in the next few years. You have my prayers and best wishes for God's blessings in all that you are doing. I hope that your studies ahead will be most fruitful and rewarding. Under a separate cover, I'm sending a copy of my book, Stride Toward Freedom. Please accept this as a gift from me. I hope that you will find this humble work of mine somewhat helpful. And this was his book that talked about the Montgomery bus boycott. So this back and forth was going on around 1959, 1960, where King is writing Deolinda Rodriguez. So you see all of these Pan-African connections. So what she would do, she would eventually study a little bit in the United States, and then she would decide to go back to Angola and join the revolutionary struggle that was being led by the MPLA, the People's Movement for Liberation of Angola. This was the left-wing movement of the nationalist movement in Angola. There were a number of groups. There were three main groups fighting for independence of Angola. But the two of them were led by African elites that only wanted to supplant the Portuguese as the exploiters. There was one called UNITA, and there was one called the FLN. And both of these groups were led by folks that they would ally with anybody if it would allow them to, because they knew the Portuguese weren't going to be able to control Angola. But they didn't want Angola to go to the masses of Angolans. They didn't want the resources of Angola, and Angola is now one of the largest oil producers in Africa. They didn't want the resources of Angola to benefit the people of Angola. They wanted to benefit themselves. So you had a group like the FLN in Angola that was trying to revive the Congo Kingdom, essentially. And they were Congo supremacists. And not only that, but they were also reactionary. And they allied themselves with South Africa, with apartheid South Africa. Let me be very clear. They allied themselves with apartheid South Africa as well as Israel. So when we go back to the comments that I made last week, when I talk about Israel's role in retarding African development and why you're not going to see many revolutionary Africans shedding tears for Israel at this moment, because we know throughout history the role Israel has played in stunting African development by backing these reactionary forces like the FLN and like apartheid South Africa, who was Israel's #1 trade partner for a time. So we know that history. But anyway, she goes back to Angola in 1962, and she trains, and she joins the revolutionary movement that's going to fight against the Portuguese, as well as these reactionary Africans that are trying to supplant the Portuguese as the new exploiters of Angola. So she trains, and she's one of the founders of the women's organization, because when she goes to the MPLA and she engages with the leadership, she says, you know, we're fighting for liberation, but it's not just the liberation of Angolan men that we're fighting for. We're fighting for the liberation of Angolan women. And what is the new Angola going to look like? How can we make sure that any elements of patriarchy, whether it's the patriarchy brought in by the Portuguese, or it was the patriarchy that was left over from aspects of traditional African culture and religion and politics that are unfavorable to women's rights, how do we expunge all of that and create a new Angola where women's rights will be upheld, where women will have equal political participation, and we will have this true revolution in Angola that will benefit everyone in the working class? So she forms the Angolan Women's Organization, the OMA in Portuguese, the OMA. And this is their emblem. It's a sister with a gun. And the MPLA, unlike those other groups, they made sure that in the areas of Angola that they ended up controlling as they're fighting this revolutionary war, they would educate women, give them political education, practical education, as well as military education. And this is why the MPLA had the largest formation of women under arms in the region. These sisters were they were mothers, they were sisters, they were daughters, and they were birthing a revolution through their intellect and through their ability to shoot people. They were trained by the Cubans. They were trained by the Cubans and formed the Kami Squadron. These were sisters. The Cubans were on the side of the Angolans, fighting for liberation. And they sent a lot of Afro-Cubans to Angola, to Guinea-Bissau, to Mozambique to assist in these struggles. So these Afro-Cubans, whose ancestors probably came from this region of West Central Africa during the period of enslavement, are now coming back and helping to liberate the African continent. Very important. Ultimately, in her fighting, she would be martyred as she and along many of her colleagues were making the cross between Zaire, at the time Zaire was now Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. There was a lot of fighting on that border. She was captured and she was killed, but not before she had done all this great work of establishing the women's movement, establishing the women's wing of the MPLA, fighting, liberating territory, creating these villages where people were getting educated and living off the revolution. So yeah, she was the U.S.-backed FNLA, U.S.-backed and Israel-backed FNLA captured her in 1968, and she was killed. But when we spent some time talking about African spirituality, your physical death is just a transition. Her spirit continued to influence the African Revolution, and the MPLA ultimately was successful. In 1972, there was a revolution in Portugal itself. Left-leaning Portuguese people took over the country. And to their credit, these Europeans said, we no longer think that Portugal should have colonies in Africa. That's against what we believe in. So again, I go back to what I said at the beginning of class. Every group of people in this world, Asia, Africa, they're all struggling against people that want to exploit them. That's a key element of humanity right now. And in Portugal, for a time, the working class in Portugal was able to overthrow a dictatorship that had been exploiting the Portuguese masses. And in true solidarity, they said, we can't be free if in our name, in the name of Portugal, that there are these colonies in Africa. So they're going to have to get independence because that's not part of what we did. So that was actually a great act of solidarity from the Portuguese. And the Portuguese left when they seized power. So Guinea-Bissau gets independence, Angola gets independence, and Mozambique gets independence. The issue is, who's going to take over? Because there was no one liberation movement. And now another war had to be fought. On one side was the MPLA, with this progressive idea of a new Angola, and the other side was the FNLA and also UNITA, who were backed by South Africa, who were backed by the United States, who were backed by Israel. Ultimately, with the help of the Cubans and other African allies, the MPLA would emerge victorious and would essentially become the leaders of New Angola. Have they kept up to their revolutionary zeal? I wouldn't say that they have. Like many revolutionary movements in Africa since independence, there have been elements in the MPLA that have gotten quite greedy. And Angola should be one of the great success stories in Africa, but it hasn't been. So that struggle still continues. But one thing the MPLA did do, they honored Deolinda Rodriguez as one of the mothers of the country. She was given this great honor, and she has statues and streets named after her in Angola because of the sacrifice that she made in her struggle, and the struggle of numerous women that joined the Angolan Women's Organization. I just want to share this and we'll close up today. The Chicago Committee for Liberation of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau was one of many organizations in the diaspora that organized around African liberation in the 1960s and 70s. So when we talk about the Black Power movement was never divorced from what was going on in the Caribbean, what was going on in Latin America, and what was going on in Africa. In the Black Panther newspapers, you would see scenes like this from Angola and from Mozambique and from South Africa of particularly African women carrying babies on their back with AK-47s in their hand, fighting against colonization. So they were literally birthing new Africans and also figuratively birthing a new Africa through their struggle. And these are the images that you would see in neighborhoods in Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston and New York, these images of the African women fighting in these liberation struggles. And they would get the literature from these organizations and translate it and spread it to the Black Power organizations, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Black Liberation Army of Assata Shakur, who we'll talk about, and others who we'll talk about in a few weeks. But I just want to read this, because this is from Maria Simao Paem, one of the thousands of women that decided to fight to free Angola in the organization that was founded by Deolinda Rodriguez. And this is just an interview from 1973. And the interviewer says, "Tell us about your experiences in Angola after the war was launched on February 1961, about the difficult situations you went through, how you had the courage to take up arms to confront the enemy, about your actual involvement in OMA, and how you were organized inside of Angola." Well, comrades, I will try to do as you ask, though there are experiences that it is hard to describe. I always told myself that one day I too would have to take up arms to avenge the many sons of our people that have fallen heroically on the battlefield. This is why I took part in the battles. Not for the last time, I hope, making my contribution in that way. After the war was launched, I went to the Nambiango forest and stayed there until 1963. This is guerrilla warfare. These are these camps that existed throughout Africa, where people would leave the city, they would go, they would get trained, and they'd get ready to fight these wars, these protracted wars. There was no organization of Angolan women inside the country at that time. So our contribution was to prepare cassava meal, cook, and wash the guerrillas' clothes. We see even the sexism at the beginning of the liberation movement. This is before people like Deolinda Rodriguez come in and say, "You're not going to have sisters just washing clothes and making cassava. We want to fight for the revolution. Train us, let us fight." And to the MPLA's credit, they did. In 1968, I went to the Eastern Front, the 3rd Region. I underwent military training and took part in an ambush and then an attack on Kiripandi Barracks. And the interviewer asked, "Did you feel proud to take part in combat?" "Yes, very proud. My direct involvement in combat made me more than ever convinced that women can in fact do many things." "Did you take part in combat solely as an MPLA militant or as an OMA militant?" "I did so as an MPLA militant and as an OMA militant who feels the domination of colonialism as well as men's domination over women. This involvement in armed struggle showed me the extent of what we could do. And I spoke to other comrades telling them what I felt. We could even fight for our own country's liberation, arms in hand. In the East, we were organized in sections, which included several mixed groups of men and women. Apart from the specific tasks entrusted to the women's leader of the section, OMA was given such common tasks as engaging in armed struggle. We lacked many things inside: salt, food, clothing, milk, and so on. We constantly prepare agricultural plots in different places so that when the enemy destroys some, there are always others. There is constant danger of being bombed, but life goes on. We have schools for both children and adults. Anyone who knows something teaches someone else. This is life in the struggle. This is what they were engaged in. And she was willing to take up arms like thousands of other women. And again, like she mentioned, they weren't fighting just against colonialism, but also against the attitudes that were either, again, a result of colonialism or residual aspects of traditional African culture that they were fighting against. I said, African men and women are equal in this struggle. We'll engage in the struggle and we'll create a new Africa where African men and women are treated equally. This is what they were fighting for. This is what we're going to see repeated in numerous stories that we're going to review over the next couple of weeks of these African women that took up arms to fight for liberation and freedom. So we'll stop there today, and next week we'll pick up with more stories of resistance against enslavement. We'll go into the Caribbean and we'll talk about these things. So we'll stop there today. I'll open it up for any questions, comments, or community announcements. Any questions?